Welcome back, Honors. So we spent a lot of time yesterday talking about some little odds and ends about like civilizations, what they are born out of, aspects of them, religion, government, which came first, a lot of different stuff. And then we spent today in class talking about the division of time into basic constructs, and we talked about movement of people, and as well as the difference between an Eastern civilization and a Western civilization, and just kind of discuss like a little like big odds and ends like that. What we're getting into tonight, though, is we were talking about Mesopotamia, because today like we got into talking about the finite little amounts of, talking about finite little details that we need to know before we get there. But let's get after it, all right? So, Mesopotamia, also known as the cradle of civilization. Now, first and foremost, it is the earliest known civilization that we believe as a historical community to have ever actually existed. Now, it's the earliest of all of them, and we believe that it's the very first place to create permanent, non-moving settlements. Now, when we're talking about, is that necessarily the case with their towns and villages and cities before that? Of course there were. However, were there concentrations as high as there were in Mesopotamia? Not at all right? It's also known as the Fertile Crescent due to the shape that the fertile land on a map actually creates, all right? So, as you can see right there, we'll get to that in a second. But, first and foremost, the word Mesopotamia comes from the Greek word meaning between two rivers. Well, really, really fast, or between the rivers, really, really fast. Stop what you're writing right now. I need you to jot this down really quick. Mesopotamia is not an individual civilization. It is a region that has held a lot of different civilizations and battling and competing peoples throughout history. But since it came first before the Egyptians by about 1,000 years, we got to give it credit for being one of the longest running. Because as you can tell, now you can keep writing, but as you can tell, it lasted for approximately about 3,000 years. If it's lasting for 3,000 years, it was home to a lot of different places. It's constantly referenced in the Bible. You heard of places like Babylon, then you have the Neo-Babylonians, and then you have the Assyrians, the Akkadians, the Sumerians, you have the Persians is one of the biggest ones out of all of them. They're so underrated. Nobody ever gives them credit. And Cyrus the Great was running around there for the longest time preaching tolerance, but no one gives them the credit they deserve, right? But remember, Mesopotamia is a region. It is not necessarily one city or place or like urban sprawled civilization, right? Well, keep going though. Lasts for about 3,000 years. Its people were the first to do one majorly important thing. They were the very, very first people to irrigate fields using a system of irrigation that was very, very basic, using a system that would move water very, very easily over different reaches of land, right? So, looking at the board right quick, we'll talk about this thing really, really fast. I haven't gotten to this stuff yet with some of my other kids, but irrigation works kind of like this. Let's say right here we have our river, right? And then we've got down here, we got Dan Becker down here, right? He's got a little farm. There's Dan Becker. I think his name's Dan. All right, well, Becker, all right. We got him down here, and he's chilling. He's growing some wheat and stuff because that's one of the very first, like, cultivized crops from this time period. One of the very first ones to actually create surpluses of. Well, here's the ultimate issue. This distance of space is almost over a kilometer in length, right? It's a very, very far away space due to the fact that you cannot plant in these regions due to floodwaters, right? So that's a problem. So you got to utilize this geographic installment of this river right here. We'll say this one is the Tigris, right? So you got to actually use it. How are you going to get water from here to there? What they would do is a system called irrigation. And what they would do is they would cut into the banks right here, which is where the natural levees existed, which we'll talk about that here in a second, which would allow the water to flow down in a system of dikes, ditches, and dams. I know some parents have just overheard me say some things that they think are not very, very appropriate to say in school, but I promise we're talking about systems of moving water, so let's all calm down. Now, anyway, and it would actually bring water to a field or to a reasonable source, and that's how a system of irrigation works. You know irrigation today as in large-scale agricultural uses whenever you see these big, giant waterers that actually, they're down in the south predominantly. They're on wheels, it's a huge pipe, and they move in big circles. If you pull up a Google map image of, like, Nebraska, you can see where they actually use these irrigation systems that are like water in big circles because a well is actually directly below it. Go into a rural picture of Nebraska, you can see where like right? They actually water in these gigantic circular patterns. Do it in Texas as well if you want to look at that. But anyway, so they were the first ones to irrigate fields. Use that system right there. Good job, Becker. And then they also devised a system of writing. Very first ones to do that. Developed mathematics. We'll talk about that after a little bit. They also invented the wheel. Super important. We don't only want any square wheels running around here. Well, if they were square, they wouldn't be running very far anyway. And they also learned how to work with metal, which was huge. But the reason why they were called the Fertile Crescent also for this region is due to the huge amount of fertile land that lay in a crescent moon shape throughout this region of the Middle East. But remember, it also existed predominantly in what is modern-day Iraq, Kuwait, Jordan, Syria, Palestine, Israel, and the northern tips of Saudi Arabia, right? So, but, keep going now. Geographic conditions are really, really important because in all actuality, Mesopotamia should not have been allowed or able to actually hold on to a civilization of the size that it actually encompassed, all right? Due to several factors. First and foremost, we've got a little rainfall, all right? That's a very, very big problem. You got a hot and dry climate, very, very arid. You've also got windstorms that leave muddy river valleys in the winter, right, that actually dry up a lot of the reserved water inside of some of these rivered areas. So they would actually have to build a lot of these irrigation systems towards fatter areas of the banks where it was actually at some of its widest points. And then also catastrophic flooding during the springtime, which actually is really cool. You might want to star that one because it relates back to their religion here in a little bit, all right? So arid soil that contains very little minerals. So, and then last but not least, little stone and timber resources at all right? So the stone and the timber resources are huge because you're talking about the fact that, like, they had very minimal amounts of building materials. However, the Mesopotamians were also some of the first people to invent simple forms of concrete later on by mixing together things like quicklime that they would actually get out of burning limestone. So you would mix that with things of, I think it's like charcoal. I got to look up the recipe again sometime, but I was reading about it this summer. And then water, and it would create rudimentary forms of concrete. But the biggest thing that they had on their side is is the fact of their irrigatable systems, right? Why live in Mesopotamia? Well, the biggest reason why you live in Mesopotamia is due to the natural levee system that it creates on its own, right? So a natural levee is an embankment or a buildup of sediment over thousands of years of flooding that actually holds the bank of the river back, okay? And it keeps it due to it keeps it in an area that can easily be cut into. So you could actually locate people on top of these banks so they can actually then descend into the river to be able to cut their irrigation systems and actually move forward with life in a more congenial fashion, right? And these natural levees, as you can see, are huge. They are enormous, all right? But they're natural. They were not man-made whatsoever. So that's a huge benefit for them, right? These natural levees are very important, as you can see here. It creates a high and safe floodplain. Down here is where you're going to be jotting some stuff down. Makes irrigation and canal construction very, very simple. Provides protection, right? Overlooking a place of elevation. In military aspects, high ground is always important. All right, so also the surrounding swamps are going to be full of fish and waterfowl because you're creating a low plain down here that creates a desert swamp area, actually preventing water from just rushing back into the river. Because if you think about it this way, if you've ever seen an eroded riverbank, all water usually flows into the rivers. These large natural levees actually made it so some of the water flows off into these desert swamp areas, right? And the fertile soil is going to actually exist over here. There was still flooding, and that would affect some of your civilians from time to time. But by the point of large-scale irrigation, they had figured out ways to use dikes and ditches and dams to actually divert some of this water away from these centralized plains. So the surrounding swamps are full of fish and different waterfowl. Reeds are going to provide food for sheep and goats and grazing animals. And then also reeds were used as a building material and used as a very, very avid resource, which was huge. So history of Mesopotamia, but getting into it, though, over the centuries, tons and tons and tons and tons and tons of people have lived in the region that you know of as Mesopotamia. Now, they are a creation of, like, a collection of independent states. You got Sumer, also known as the Sumerians, which is towards the southern end from about 3500 to 2000 BC. You got the Akkadians, home of Sargon the Great, right, doing his thing, setting up a fledgling bureaucratic system, but also a full-scale educational system with scribal tutorials. And then that's in the northern part. That's from about 2340 to 2180 when they actually took over the Sumerians, who invented the very first wheel, just a quick heads up. Babylonians, these two regions were unified in 1830 to 1500 BC and 650 to 500 BC. The reason why there's a big jump right here is due to the fact that they were owned by these guys, the punks below them. That actually, from this point underneath where it says 650 to 500, you should put Neo-Babylonian. Some of you probably heard of this guy before named Nebuchadnezzar, all right? So I have a really cool story I'll tell you in class about the most romantic thing on the planet that Nebuchadnezzar ever did, and when he created the Hanging Gardens of Babylon. Ask me about it tomorrow. Don't let me forget. Whoever asks me about it tomorrow, maybe I'll hit you up with some extra credit or something like that, all right? So anyway, but Assyrians, right? The Assyrians are one of the big military, dynastic government styles that had ever existed. Now, the development of writing in schools is another big advent of the Mesopotamian culture, okay? So, speaking of their development of writing, we got to talk about what writing is and how it kind of pushed forward throughout the ages, okay? So first of all, there are 3 types of writing, okay? There are pictograms, ideograms, phonetics, okay? Pictograms is what you think of when you think about your ancient civilizations, using pictures to show meaning, right? One picture could mean this, or one picture could mean that, and the writing form of cuneiform, that we'll actually talk about here in a second or two, is a pictogram, slightly ideographic style of writing, okay? Ironically enough, we can't read it due to the fact that it has never carried over. We can read Egyptian hieroglyphics, but we'll get to why we can read Egyptian hieroglyphics when we talk about Napoleon in the 1800s, right? So we're a long ways away from that. But we cannot read this pictographic, ideographic writing of the Mesopotamians anymore. But anyway, pictures showing meaning, that's your pictogram. Ideograms is a sign that represents a word or an idea, all right? So something a little bit more complex. Hieroglyphics have styles of ideographic writing in it as well. But the one we use, style of writing, we use a phonetic style of writing. Phonetic is when signs are used to represent sounds. And the repetition of sounds goes together to create words that have meaning, and boom, we use a phonetic alphabet. We'll talk about who that comes from later on. So the phonetic system is the basis of most current day writing systems, okay? But staying after it, there we go, move myself over a little bit. The greatest contribution of the Mesopotamian region through all of Western civilization was the invention of writing. Don't get it crossed. It is the invention of writing. It allowed for the transmission of knowledge, the codification of laws, records to facilitate trading and farming. Sumerians wrote on wet clay tablets that they would actually use the point of a reed. It was really, really neat. They would take a huge thing of clay from a riverbank and mix it with a little bit of, I don't really actually know the sediments that they would mix it with. I actually probably should look that up. They would take it up and they would just slap it on top of a stone, form it, and then use a reed to write in it and then allow it to dry in the sun, right? Now, cuneiform actually meaning wedge-shaped due to the actual setup of these little triangles that they would use using the ends of these reeds was excuse me. It's specifically taught to scribes because they were the only ones that actually knew how to read or write. So most people, writing was huge and it was great that they invented it, but most people did not know how to read or write if you lived in Mesopotamia. Only scribes were really ones that held the abilities to read and write. They're going to serve as priests, record keepers, accountants, state officials, parts of the small bureaucratic systems, tax collectors, a lot of things like that. But just because you were a scribe doesn't mean you were just stuck being a scribe for the rest of your life, right? So now as society evolved, the first form of writing was developed that's called cuneiform, is right here over on the left. And that is from about 3500 BC, okay? Now, cuneiform is going to spread all the way to Persia, it's going to spread to Egypt, and it's going to become the vehicle of growth and spread of civilization. It's going to create also a massive exchange of ideas among cultures, all right? So we are going to continue to talk about that tomorrow when we get into class, and we're going to talk about the education of scribes in Mesopotamia, right? So I hope you guys have enjoyed this so far, but we'll get back after it tomorrow. Y'all have a great evening. See y'all then.